I stand here as a social scientist and essentially working from the perspective that there's no good theorising without empirical data, and without theorising, empirical data is just data, or are just data to be correct grammatically. And so one goes with the other, and that's my approach, and what I'm going to offer and how I stand before you. Okay. Well, my starting point is this well-worn path, and that you'll all be familiar with, and that Barbara also mentioned in her presentation. This classic argument about the justification of so-called hate crime laws. And opponents argue, we will all know, the two sides of this debate. Opponents argue that the additional punishment of crimes without a bias covered by hate crime laws amounts to the punishment of ideas, bad character, to use Heidi Herd's words, improper thinking, and as Jacobs and Potter famously said, extra punishment for values, thoughts and opinions which the government deems abhorrent. So how can we get around this? And this is the task that has engaged me for about a decade now. Sadly, some of you might think sadly, because on the other side of this, what I soon discovered when I set out to explore this question was that supporters of hate crime laws argue that despite the claims of their opponents, supporters of hate crime laws argue that the greater punishment is imposed for the greater harms inflicted by hate crimes. The supporters of the laws are not in the business of punishing ideas, bad character, improper thinking, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they claim that they support the provisions for punishment for the consequences of hate crime. And therefore, from this viewpoint, as I've put here on this slide behind me, the motive of the offender, i.e. their ideas, their bad character, their improper thinking, is only relevant, and only relevant from this perspective, to determine whether a particular act committed, so-called hate crime, and that inflicts greater harms than the same type of act, that's a different act from the same type of act that occurs for other reasons. So the motive is only an indicator of the empirical phenomenon. It's not the motive that's being punished. There's a lot to unravel there, and the number of perspectives here to unravel, which I aim to do over about the next 35 minutes, and aiming to leave some time for discussion. Well, what I want to do is just chart my own intellectual journey through this and my research journey through this. And my purpose of this is to try and unravel my provenance of thinking step by step with you. So my aim is not just to provide you with a list of bibliography of publications, not at all. But across this period of time, to try and unfold step by step how my thinking about it develops, to try and persuade you. That's my purpose. My first thinking about this appeared in an article called "Hate Crimes Hurt More" in the American Behavioral Scientist, and you can't see it here. What I've got in red underneath, it hasn't come out on this screen. But there I carried out 26 in-depth interviews in Boston and New York in the late 1990s, very kindly funded by the British Academy on overseas funds to fund this research, where, as really a novice, I talked to prominent supporters and prominent opponents of hate crime laws. I was aware of this debate. We hadn't had it in the UK. Our new Labour government, at the time I was framing this research, was thinking about the legislation. And I identified many people will know those, the types of people who I spoke to, or the individuals who I spoke to. Prominent academic, commentators, politicians, journalists, and civil rights activists. Sounds a lot, but 26 people. In-depth interviews with these respondents in Boston, New York. Quite simply starting from the point, on the back of an envelope, what's your take on hate crime laws, and how do you justify it? I knew who was for and against. Please explain your position and let's talk it through. So basically, qualitatively, that's what I did. And so that shaped my thinking right away, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Took that further in a publication published in Hungarian, although there was an English translation, thankfully, called How Hate Hurts, which I took that early thinking from the qualitative work to the literature that was moving along at the time, engaged with the literature. So that essay is essentially a literature review, where I engage with the ideas in the literature. During that time, my notion about the harms of hate crime was developing, as were other contemporaries in the field, as the research was progressing, and I think we're moving along together. And then had a great opportunity then to analyse a large quantitative data set. I'm a mixed methods man, quantitative and qualitative man, so I do all sorts. Where I analysed British crime survey data on self-reported racist incidents, where we could actually unravel the harms, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And I present those findings mostly in the book, in chapter 4 of the book Hate Crime in the City, in the chapter Tensions and Liberalism and the Criminalisation in Hate. And then more recently, with commissions from our UK Equality and Human Rights Commission, I was very pleased to get commissions to analyse more recent data sets from the British Crime Survey, because in the mid-1980s, when I did that earlier work, in terms of the demographic questions of respondents, in terms of their identity, respondents were only asked about their ethnic group. But then in latter years, questions were introduced about their religion, sexual orientation, whether the respondent had any disability. So the potential had increased, so I was very pleased to get that opportunity. And these findings are, this one has just been published this month by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And this one is being published in October, where we unfold the findings. So that's part of the trajectory. What I'm going to do next is turn to the research findings itself, and in this kind of chronology, try and unfold my thinking that's been informed by the research. Does that sound okay to you? Good. Can't see anybody nodding off quite yet, so that's always promising. Well, in the 2001 article, I'm an applied sociologist, so sociologists like to conceptualise. And here was conceptualisation on the basis of the data. It might take you a few moments to get your heads around this. This is just there for dramatic purposes. But this pictorial representation of my conceptual thinking emerged out of those 26 interviews. And this was the product of them, with a discussion around it in that 2001 article. I was taken aback coming from the UK, where we weren't so bound up about rights to freedom of expression and so on. And in fact, I'll refer to this a bit later on, the street fighting left never had a problem about being punitive against racists. They would use their fists rather than law against the racists. So there was never any problem. And in terms of my own problems, I came out of, it'd be a gross exaggeration to say I was a street fighter, of course not, but came out of that same kind of tradition of left-wing anti-racist work. Whereas in the United States, I was taken aback when supporters of hate crime laws said to me, we are strong defenders of First Amendment rights as well. So I say, well, how do you support these laws then? And they were saying to me that, well, look, we're not, as I said earlier, we're not punishing thought or expression. We're advocating additional punishment for the additional harms. So I said, well, tell me about those harms, unravel them then, as you're thinking. And that's what they did. And then it struck me, and so this wasn't my own thinking, I sort of conceptualised this from the words that respondents offered to me. There's a dark blob in the middle that you can't fully see there, which is the initial victim. And some of the respondents said to me that the initial victim hurts more. I remember now, and 12 years ago, of talking to a counsellor in a centre specialised in gay men's health, saying, look, Paul, you walk out of here and you had your mobile, you're mugged in the street and you have your mobile phone stolen. Believe you me, 12 years ago, my mobile phone was about that big. You know, that's bad enough, that's threatening enough. So, but you know, you walk out of here and somebody calls you an effing faggot and pushes you. That's rather more threatening because, you know, with your mobile phone taken, that's bad. But, you know, if you're careful next time, you know, you won't flash it. You'll be careful where you get your phone out. But when you're targeted because of your identity, you carry the reasons for your victimization around with you. And why should we seek to hide them? Okay. So you're always potentially a victim. Not only that, you're always potentially under threat. Not only that, it strikes at the core of who you are. Very persuasive argument, huh? And then building on the words of others were saying to me, those who share the victim's identity, who come to hear about that attack, are terrorised too. They experience similar kind of post-traumatic stress type symptoms. We just think about the ripple effect, as Monique Knoll called it in a terrific paper, of the Matthew Shepard murder, thousands of miles away across the United States. And then, you know, others were telling me, look, Paul, I remember one respondent, I quote to students because they said, geez, and now you see this on the American movies. So, geez, Paul, you know, if you're a member of a Hispanic community and you hear that a black person in the area is attacked, you're going to be thinking, I could be next. Okay. So this spread beyond those communities. And then, finally, this outer ring is rather more diffuse. But I was sat in Attorney General's office, I won't say which one, and I thought that I was a young teenager watching American TV again because my respondent was sat in front of the window, the sun was shining behind him, stars and stripes next to him, and he said, look, Paul, and I think he genuinely meant this. He said, look, Paul, equality, I think he genuinely meant this, the reality might be a different matter, but equality, respect for diversity and difference is at the core of this nation's fundamental values. And every act of hate crime is an attack upon those values. So, Paul, every act of hate crime is an attack on what I believe in. So you can think of a normative harm there. So, whole range of harms. Fine for theorising at that point, but as a social scientist, I then wanted to embark on a task to see, can we empirically verify any of these? Because there are very important reasons, not only for the hate debate, for trying to settle the hate debate one way or another, but also if victims do experience additional harms, well then obviously understanding the nature of those harms is crucial for intervening and working, supporting victims. So I carried on down that path. And the individual, focusing on the individual empirically seemed the most promising. I think I can now move out of that in these rings, but I think I've spent the first 10 years of this empirical project. It feels very sad as I'm saying it. I've only got another 12 years left before my career will have to come to an end, so I've got to move on. But focusing on the individual seemed the most fruitful way, first of all, thinking that we could actually empirically measure this. Well, in a later work, I'm just jumping ahead a bit in the chronology, and this was a book in Barbara Perry's set, the general editor, your 5-volume set, where Barbara kindly asked me to edit the second volume on the consequences of hate crime. So we put together psychotherapists, psychologists, within the same covers, and sociologists, so Neil is in there with his colleague John, for instance, on their perspectives on the consequences of hate crime victimisation. Eva Tibbe, a Swedish sociologist from Stockholm, has a beautiful chapter in there, informed by her empirical survey data, where she unravels, I think this is really nicely, the individual consequences, ranging from the mind up to relationships, home relationships, work, leisure activities, trust, confidence, and people's sense of resignation about society. There's a great deal of thinking there to unravel. I've only, realistically, I think, been able to try and empirically unravel this one, the mind. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, just jumping back a bit, though, to the Hungarian paper. In that literature review, I tried to deal with some of the alleged harms of hate crimes, and a notion around at the time was that hate crimes are more likely to inflict physical injuries. So hate crime victims are more likely to end up in hospital, experience physical assault, and so on. Now, intuitively, it didn't seem right to me. And I can say that my own empirical data from the British Crime Survey doesn't bear this out at all. And in Hate Crime in the City, can clearly empirically demonstrate on the basis of the British Crime Survey, which is a large-scale population victimisation survey, a random sample, commissioned by the Home Office, so not a left-wing loony think tank, by the state, clearly demonstrates that victims of racist incidents are no more likely to experience physical injuries than victims of incidents believed by the victims to be motivated for other reasons. Now, in that paper, the Hungarian paper, I engaged with the logic of that. It didn't seem too logical to me, and later on the empirical data for me ruled that one out. The emotional harms I'll come back to very shortly. But at the time, the state of the literature and the state of the research was growing, and for instance, Heidi Hurd in her works has cited some of this literature, and it was dogged. And we're only talking about only a decade ago, but it was dogged by small, purposive, i.e. non-random samples, so self-selected samples. As a methodologist, that's the first fundamental major problem about any generalization. Secondly, the lack of control groups. So victims of hate crimes weren't controlled with victims of otherwise motivated crimes. And two major problems, fundamental problems there. So it was expanding our understanding, but still speculative, I would suggest. And I think McDevitt and Balboni's survey work took that a bit further, because they did introduce control group, but it was still a self-selected, non-random sample. Fundamental problem. Hence, the British Crime Survey offered the panacea to that by offering a large-scale random sample, which I'll come to in a moment. And in that paper, I also discussed the terroristic impacts, the in terrorem harms, and the normative harms, which I will return to in my presentation. So, on to the mind now, the individual impacts that most of my research endeavours have been on. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to engage with these charts. These are there for my purpose, for dramatic purposes, so that you're looking at something else other than staring at me, because that will make me very nervous. So, let me just talk you around these figures. The annual British Crime Survey is a crime victimisation survey. Respondents are selected from postcode address files, and it's a stratified random sampling procedure, and about 40,000 respondents a year. Now, that might sound quite a lot, but when you want to mine down, it's not enough. So for this earlier work, I merged 3 years' data sets, which you can do at the comfort of your own desk and computer. And so 120,000 respondents altogether. You find that about a quarter of those respondents say that they've been a victim of a crime in the last 12 months. They're asked that. Then they're asked what type of crime. And for anybody who says that they've been a victim of a crime, then they're asked all sorts of questions. Where did it happen? Who did it? Did you see the person who did it? And what really interested me was, did you have an emotional reaction? Yes or no? If you said yes, how much? A lot, I think very much, a little, not at all. Not very sophisticated questions, but better than nothing. And then if you did say that you had an emotional reaction, that's where I think it gets more interesting. What type of emotional reaction? And respondents are given a whole list of post-traumatic stress-like symptoms. Anxiety, depression, sleeplessness, crying, things like that. I'm going to unravel to you. So what I was able to do here, I was able to compare racially motivated versus non-racially motivated crimes. It's a survey of crimes only. It doesn't include non-crime incidents. The way it's decided whether these are racially motivated is victims are asked, for every crime, do you think the crime occurred because of your race or ethnicity? Yes or no? So it's the victim's perspective. In recent years, they've been asked now, do you think it occurred because of any disability you have, any sexual orientation, because of your religion, and so forth. So I was able to control racially motivated against non-racially motivated incidents, control for crime type, these are major crime groups, and what do we find here? Remarkably, to me, it seemed actually to bear out the evidence. First of all, the key thing to point out is that most victims of crime, the great majority reported that they had an emotional reaction in the 80%. Okay? But consistently across different crime types, when you compare victims of racially motivated incidents against non-racially motivated incidents, a higher proportion of victims of racially motivated incidents reported that they had an emotional reaction. And I think that's quite statistically, that's quite, not all these statistically significant, but out of these 6 categories, 5 of them are, in terms of those differences. Irrefutable evidence to begin with, it seems to be that hate crimes hurt more on the individual level, in terms of the mind. What was also interesting for me were that threats, 91.2% of victims of racially motivated threats said they had an emotional reaction, compared to 92.4% of victims of attempted assault. Intuitively, it doesn't seem right, but when you think through the reasons why these impacts might occur, we can see that the actual crime type doesn't make a difference. Therefore, in presentations to policy audiences who've been very fond of using the term low-level hate crime, I've been banging on saying we should remove that term out of the vocabulary because a threat for one person can hurt just as much as a punch on the nose. Okay. So that began to empirically validate that claim that hate crimes hurt more. Again, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to digest this and report back later. But then when we begin to mine down now to think about respondents who reported they had an emotional reaction, the strength of the emotional reaction was very much. How much? Very much. Then the differences, still controlling for crime type, still comparing racially motivated and non-racially motivated. This time into the analysis, I throw a comparison between minority ethnic groups and whites. Very interestingly, for whites who claim they were victims of racist incidents, these differences hold too for the impacts, which I think is quite illuminating. But the differences now between racially motivated and non-racially motivated incidents begins to grow. So the impacts are seen to be even greater when we begin to ask about the strength of the impact. Does that make sense to you? Sort of came out a bit convoluted. And just to take it a bit further then, when we look at the types of emotional reaction now, respondents were asked about anger, shock, fear, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, loss of confidence, difficulty sleeping, crying, tears, annoyance. Well, you can see almost consistently, apart from, intuitive, conceptually this is very interesting, I think, apart from anger and annoyance, but for the other kind of symptoms, the impactful symptoms, consistently, when we compare victims of racially motivated, non-racially motivated crimes, for all these post-traumatic stress-like symptoms, higher proportions of victims of racially motivated crimes report these symptoms. I also controlled that for crime type, and age and gender, and it holds. These differences holds. So that's the beauty of statistical work. So I think here this evidence is irrefutably beginning to demonstrate that for the individual, hate crimes hurt more, on average, for the individual. Obviously, there are some individuals in here who weren't hurt, and some victims of non-racially motivated incidents that were hurt more than victims of racially motivated incidents. But when comparing group for group, thinking about the averages, I have the proportions here. Hate crimes hurt more. I think that's irrefutable when we think about it on a group basis. Well, this chart, again, is perhaps even less challenging for you. Again, it's there for my benefit. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of this trajectory, I had the great opportunity of funding from the Equality and Human Rights Commission now to take more recent data sets of the British Crime Survey and test out this early finding. Because what I wanted to do was test out with racist incidents, as an empiricist in this way, trying to inform thinking, let's check this with more recent data and see if it still holds, to validate it. And it did for the racist incidents. And additionally, it gave me the opportunity, what about other groups of victims then? What about victims who were perceived they were targeted because of their sexual orientation, their disability, because of their religion? Did it for all of them? And I can tell you, it holds. It still holds. And here's just a snapshot. Those victims who said they had a disability, about 25% of respondents said they had a disability. And this was a limiting disability. So I've confined it to those who had a limiting disability or illness. Again, what you'll see from this, if you had the time to interrogate it, is that these are just all victims with a disability. And I'm comparing here crimes that I call them identity crime, loosely, crimes that they believed occurred because of their disability, compared with crimes that they believed occurred for other reasons. So identity crime versus other crime, but they're all disabled respondents. You can see, just take one, fear, 39.8% of disabled victims of identity crime reported feeling fearful afterwards, compared with 19.4% of disabled respondents of other crimes. Those differences hold. Again, obviously I'm going to spare you, not by not unravelling all the variables here. You might be relieved to know you have to take my word for it at the moment. Well, but when you disaggregate all of this and test it out and control for age, type of crime, gender, all the major variables that you control for, these differences hold. So for me, it's QED. In terms of that might be a very foolish thing, silly thing to say, but in terms of this for the individuals, it's QED in terms of the emotional harms on a group basis. Well, that's the empiricism. So where does it come to the thinking? And I'll try to leave myself about 10 minutes for that. Well, thanks for humouring me. I've tried to build up the evidence base for this, so I can try and now be persuasive in my speculation. Okay. So here goes. And I call this a discussion section. And I hope you'll permit me to get through my discussion and then bounce back at me. Well, I think what I've offered and what I've been exploring is a consequentialist account of wrongdoing. Heidi Hurd might recognise those ideas and those words. I'm not plagiarising you, Heidi, I fully acknowledge that this seemed familiar to you, of me thinking about your writings. I think what I'm clearly offering here is a consequentialist account of wrongdoings. Now, from one perspective then, we could argue that the greater penalties imposed by hate crime laws, whatever shade they are, provide offenders with their just deserts. The greater penalty for the greater harms inflicted. But I think, interestingly, we could actually quantify those greater harms. So if we think of proportionate harms, we're thinking about definitely greater harms, but we're thinking about 10% on the margin. Whereas certainly in legislation in England and Wales, I think for some offences, racially aggravated offences, we've actually got a doubling of the penalty. Joanna would know better than I will, possibly, about... Yeah, so we could say there's a disproportionate enhancement there compared to the empirical phenomenon. So I think it cuts both ways there. So in terms of justice, the just desserts seem fair. But then the question is about the extent of those just desserts. I think that's the issue. But I think there are rather more conceptually challenging questions than that. And here goes, listed here under the problems. First of all, about the culpability. And this was raised in Barbara's presentation and in some of the discussion that followed that. Because this is where I've got my sword out and actually knife one of my friends. Sorry, Barbara. I used to be a Manchester City supporter, then I went over to Manchester United, and then I'm back on Manchester City, so I don't have any truck with swapping sides. Where the culpability for these harms is, I think, is very instructive to think through. And I try and reflect on this to some degree in that chapter in Hate, Crime and the City. And Barbara, do you remember that I sent you the draft of that chapter saying, how do you feel about me saying this? Because the structural account, I think, is very, very persuasive. But I think where I would differ with Barbara in a friendly way is your notion of hate crime offenders being instrumental actors and purposely and instrumentally and consciously rebuilding this structural hierarchy. I would suggest that we are over-socialising and over-intellectualising the actions of offenders by that. Okay. And I feel comfortable saying that because I think we swapped those ideas between us and swapped that draft between us to see if it was okay with you for me to say this. And I'd just like to try and unravel where that thinking came from, because looking at work that I haven't listed here that's gone on with offenders and looking at the motivations of offenders, working from police crime reports and then contemporaries, looking at their work, and then more recently my own work of talking with offenders. It seems very clear to me that in many of these incidents, offenders just can't figure. They had no notion of the consequences, right? And they would have no understanding of the structural harms that they're inflicting, even the individual harms. So we're actually thinking about this consequentialist account of wrongdoing is an account of the unintended consequences of intended actions. These incidents are happening for all sorts of other reasons. Offenders are not specialist, paid-up hate crime offenders. Most practitioners working with such offenders in the UK would argue this. They are generalists. You find that they're involved in all sorts of other offending behaviour, a whole plethora of offending behaviour. It's just that in some circumstances, under some conditions, their prejudice, bias, bigotry, hate, whatever you want to call it, weighs in, an opportunity presents itself, or there's another conflict going on, and the incident becomes aggravated by their racism or homophobia. It's thrown in under UK legislation, which I think is a strict liability approach, where the prosecution just has to manifest evidence manifest hostility, not motivation. Those types of offending are caught under the law. But I would argue that rarely do such offenders intend the consequences that they inflict, the unintended consequences. Some do, but we're probably confined to that 5% of ideologues there, who are rather more clever and careful anyway than the street-level, everyday offenders. Secondly, the second problem with thinking about this is that if these offenders, and this was raised in the last presentation, in the discussion, that we've got the proxy problem here for punishment, because if we're arguing that these offenders are simply acting as proxies for the rest of the communities, and that's a very persuasive argument, Barb, and I share it myself in trying to engage first-year students. I think back to my formative years where I grew up, to use an American term, a housing project in South Manchester. In Britain we call it a council estate. In South Manchester, where I knocked around with my peers. My formative years were 13, 14, 15. I can remember in my head right now all the racist, homophobic, sexist, anti-Jewish jokes. Muslims were on our horizon at the time. We didn't know Muslims existed at that point. That came later. Well, Asians certainly did. We called them other things, okay? So black people, Caribbeans certainly did. Jews certainly did, and so on. You imagine it. These thoughts are in my mind now. Can you believe that? after 3 university degrees, how many years of education, they're still there. I'm thinking of them now, right now. And I would say, though, I'd like to think I don't act on them. Okay? So I'm part of this structure. It's woven into me, and I'm part of this structure. And the interesting thing for me is about individual action and individual psychology. What makes somebody else who's part of the same cultural tapestry act on those values or bring those values into their offending, and others, like me, not? I think that's the... And I think I would argue that rather than the structure, as Jack Katz famously said in his book, The Seductions of Crime, we need to look at things not from the background to the foreground, but turn it on its head and look at the foreground, and that then will shine light on the background. So it's in the individual dynamics of offending. I think we can look at this. But there's a problem also, of culpability, that if offenders are just a proxy for the rest of us, then in terms of social justice, how fair is it to apply punishment just for those who manifest those values? I think I've tried to cover points 2 and 3 there. If I move on to the 4th point about disadvantaged offenders, I think the debate that has come in the UK has been about citing the disadvantages of offenders. And I gave a presentation on Thursday this week where the chair of the European Association of Social Workers wheeled it in against me on a talk like this and said, and I'd actually been called a member of the neocon liberal elite in a recent publication for trying to unravel these things. I like being called a member of the elite. Neocon, I don't know. For saying, that I'm advocating popular punitivism here in punishment for this, and when I'm talking about just deserts. And the argument usually cited is that these offenders are disadvantaged themselves, often. Well, I've got 2 ways of looking at this. One, if we think about the scale of racist offending, it could be about 3 to 4, if you think of all hate crime incidents in the UK, possibly about 400,000 incidents a year if we use estimates from the British Crime Survey. It beggars belief to think that all of those offenders are socially disadvantaged. Okay? And many of them, I think, are rather more people like me. But of course, many of them are. So this leads me to finish off in thinking about the function of the law, punitive or rehabilitative. And I think in terms of knifing both sides in the back with my sword, I would put myself in both sides. As informed by this empirical evidence about the greater consequences, just at the individual level, first of all, informed about this empirical evidence about the greater consequences, that a greater penalty for offenders seems to be just in terms of them receiving their just deserts. It seems to be just for victims in terms of the equilibrium being restored here, that the criminal law acting to restore the equilibrium. That's what would be called the neocon in me. While the liberal in me would say that punitiveness, a punitive penalty, is not the only type of penalty, of course, and we can have other types of penalties, such as a rehabilitative penalty, where there's a rehabilitative effort attached to it. And certainly that's what I would favour rather than punitivism. And what's interesting in this, personally I found, in moving through this and then beginning work with victims, and a recent project looking at rehabilitation programmes for convicted victims of hate crime across Europe. Most of the programmes said to me, what was beginning to come out of the empirical research, that very few of those offenders are ideologues. For instance, I had a meeting in June. I was with Exit Sweden in Stockholm, funded by an NGO, Freischütz, if I pronounced that correctly, where they have former members of a neo-Nazi far-right scene who've gone over to the other side, and that they're now working with young people to try and help them leave the movements. And they said to me, which really bore out the empirical evidence that many of their young people, we think of these as right-wing skinhead thugs, the type of young person that I would think about lying awake at night, should I get an extra lock on my door? I say, ideology rarely comes into it. They get involved in these incidents for all sorts, and these loose groupings that we call gangs, for all sorts of reasons. Peer pressures, problems at home, all sorts of things that young people, the same in my neighbourhood, join these kind of loose groupings and get into trouble and so on. And often these young people want to leave the groups when the older ones try and introduce the ideology to them. They begin to think twice about it. Found this there, found it in Germany for a rehabilitation programme. Ideology barely figured. In fact, what they were working with the offenders was how they can cope with the stresses and strains of everyday lives that led them to offend in the instant. Now, some research on offenders has shown that they deny their racism. And liberal sociologists that sort of used to count myself amongst them would say, this is minimising their racism. As offenders are just talking it away. But I actually think there's something in this when we actually look at it. It's only one part of their offending impulses. And practitioners have recognised this. They don't put offenders through re-education classes. They don't put them through anti-racist courses like we put our sociology students through. Cognitive behavioural approaches they use. That also these types of approaches can be used on other offenders. So hopefully I've left a few minutes for some discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Once again, I will abuse my position. Just a very quick question. You're controlled for a lot of factors when you reach this conclusion that hate crimes hurt more. There are two factors that I wonder if you have controlled for. Presumably, the mechanism by which hate crime hurt more is that the I could be next thought when it comes to secondary victim, but also for the primary victim, that this is because of this feature. So I wonder, have you controlled for other random acts of violence, whether they hurt more as well? And the second is that hate crimes are much more likely than other motivated crimes to be committed by groups. Mm-hmm. And whether you have control for whether group crime also hurt more, if that might be what's actually active here rather than the hate.
Okay. Empirically, I can answer those as yes, no, and no. The yes is controlling, yes, for those random things, control for those. More likely to be committed by groups. The British Crime Survey data doesn't really bear that out, that kind of speculation in the literature when we look at it, because victims are asked how many offenders. There isn't a great difference there. And also repeat victimisation. There are higher levels, but it's not significant. For instance, with the disability incidents, I've most latterly, that I didn't cite here, been working commissioned by the Equality and Human Rights Commission of Scotland to look at Scottish Crime and Justice Survey data. I'd like to do it in Sweden next with their crime survey data. And disabled respondents were no more likely, on the basis of their own self-reports, to be targeted in repeat victimisation or series of victimisation or multiple victimisation. The rate of victimisation was about the same as other victims. Now, just very quickly, what your question and questions inspired me to think about is what actually hurts, and I think that's very interesting. And some of the contributors to this volume in Barbara's set that I edited unravel this. When we actually think about it, we do get back to the offender's attributed values. Okay? Whether those offenders intended them or not. But the perceived values, the perceived message, if you like, taken by the victim, whether or not the offender meant it. And in most occasions, I believe the offender didn't mean it. What actually hurts when we think about it is the values, sentiments of the offender. That's what hurts. So in the end, to join all the dots up in this circle, we are going back for additional punishment for the values, ideas, thoughts of the offenders, whichever way we think about it.
Okay. So I was going to ask about punishment, and just to follow up on some of the points that you made towards the end of the paper. Obviously, you haven't spoken to victims directly about their expectations of punishment, but just on the basis of your own experience with working with victims and your own knowledge, what do you think a victim's expectation is? Do they demand a punitive response? Are they more interested in seeing justice in terms of a restorative intervention, coming face to face with the offender, or would that repel them? Would that idea of coming face to face with an offender really repel them? As you know, there's a lot more work on restorative justice in a hate crime context now. So I was just interested to know what both of you think.
I can offer a variety of views which are speculation based on anecdotal evidence. And I'm a bit cautious about that, given what I said about my belief in empiricism for these things. But here's the speculation from talking to people. There are a number of different perspectives. For instance, victims' rights movements, advocacy movements, we look at disability hate crime has really captured the agenda in the UK, as you know. It's been very powerful and effective. And they leading activists there do advocate greater punishment. I believe they're arguing for a punitive approach, that offenders get their just deserts there. Not all of them, but a lot of them go for that. They want the greater punishments. When you talk to individual victims, and I talk to police officers, for instance, about this in some of my research, when police officers have started to use the language of hate crime, some police officers, more than one, has been very amusingly been happy to share with me. They've said to me, victims have said to me, so I was a victim of a hate crime then. And they can see the kind of victimisation unravelling even further. So, you know, again, anecdotally, I would suggest that many victims aren't thinking this way themselves. And we think about the efforts around third-party reporting and dissatisfaction with the police, is that I would suggest that most victims simply want a resolution, something to be done, and for it to be taken seriously. When it comes to the management of offender, that is a different matter. That's where they begin to stop. But you might see I'm hesitating there. That's because I'm speculating, so I'll stop there. Right?
Can I speak to it as well? Because I just want to take the opportunity to respond to that question. The qualitative work I've done, and especially again with the Native American community, I mean, these were pretty intensive interviews, hour to 6 hours in interviews, and I always ask the question, what do you think can be done, should be done, needs to be done to respond to hate crime? And rarely do people talk about, and these are victims and potential victims both, rarely do they speak about, wanting to see people punished harshly. They are much more interested in educative efforts, preventative efforts, those sorts of things. So even in terms of punishment, I would suggest that they're not that interested in punishment so much as they are in the rehabilitative approach. That is, that communities need to be educated about one another, and that the affected communities also need to be educated about their own rights and how they can stand up against it. So it doesn't often focus or come into play for victim communities very often in that respect. Amongst activist entities and organizations, it often does, but I think amongst sort of general population, not so much. Yeah.
Okay, since your subtitle was moral philosophical basis, as a moral philosopher, I feel like I have to say something, perhaps something a little bit critical on that side, and here I'm going to be drawing on Heidi's work and the work of others in that respect. So I think that the British crime survey data is very convincing on averages, but it seems to me that talk of averages is useful in the context of policy more generally, but probably not fit for the purpose of criminal law. So if you think that criminal law is about holding individuals responsible for individual acts, and one fundamental principle of that, is equality before the law. If you have the same crime, you need to have the same punishment. But given that all that the data shows is these kind of average trends, that leaves open many kinds of possible cases where enhanced punishment for hate crime, and we need to talk about what precisely is the crime at issue here. Whether that's going to be fair. So take one kind of case that comes up in the literature is a thick-skinned victim of who isn't harmed psychologically, should the offender, individual offender, be punished more seriously in that case or not? Yeah. The averages don't seem to matter for that. Or take the misperceiving victim who experiences greater psychological harm, but in fact the perpetrator wasn't motivated by these. What should we do about that case? If we just focus on harm as justification, it would seem that we would have to punish that person more. That seems totally unfair. Sure. And finally, as your data shows, there are a lot of victims who are victims of non-hate crime, but have the similar kind of psychological injury. Not as many, but still a lot of them. So it doesn't seem fair toward them that people who attack them are punished less severely than those who attack, say, minorities. So it seems that can't really justify hate crime legislation in the context of criminal law on the basis of the actual harm caused, especially when it's harm that's based on perceived motivation rather than actual motivation. So I think that it has to be, when you look at the data, it is convincing, and we must make some use of that. But it seems like it's sort of more broad public policy of addressing these issues is the venue for that rather than criminal law.
Sure. Okay. Can I respond to that? Yes. Briefly? Okay. I agree with you and disagree with you. See how I jump sides. So, and I meant to say in one of my lines, in a little script written somewhere to open up, that I stand before you as a professional social scientist, but as an absolute amateur philosopher of the criminal law. So I take my cap off there. However, yes, indeed, I think you're perfectly correct. And thank you, and I'll pay you later, because this is where I got a little bit tied myself around these 2 points. And I've meant to focus at this point here on this proxy problem of punishment. Yes, indeed. What I should have said here, and what I would also similarly argue, is that not all hate crime offenders inflict those harms. And so how fair is it to hold them culpable for those harms? It doesn't seem just or fair. And I'm aware of Heidi Hurd's writings on this thoughts on this matter. And intuitively, it seems absolutely correct. But if we begin to look at the numbers and think about the odds, and also bear in mind that there are a few ways of looking at this, I think, that help me move into a liberal position and away from this neocon line on this. Help me slip back into this liberal position. And that is, I've only dealt with the individual harms, because, say, all the rest are speculative. But if we could empirically begin to unravel all of these other harms, and I think I can with the next wave, but I'll need a couple of years to work through the data about the secondary victimisation, because I think if you can control who was a victim, who wasn't, and so on, I think you can empirically demonstrate these victimisation effects. Okay, so that that person who is punched on the nose or abused is only the first victim. There are many others. So the harm is not only in the data that we have here, I would argue, it spreads beyond that. Secondly, I would think, again, to make me feel more comfortable as a self-professed liberal, if I was advocating a harsh punishment, a punitive line, I would feel very uneasy about working on the law of averages, very uneasy indeed. But when it comes to suggesting rehabilitative interventions, re-education, counselling, I feel rather more comfortable about that we might catch in that net some people who are not fully deserving of that. That seems to me a lot safer. And on the basis of the law of averages and catching them, that seems to me a good kind of cost-benefit calculation to make. That's how I'd do it. Okay.
I'm terribly sorry, but we have to stop now and go to get some lunch. But we can definitely keep on discussion during that, and in the afternoon we will have an entire discussion session. So thanks again, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks.